Will generative AI push the boundaries of creativity and expand human knowledge? Well, that's certainly what its boosters think. Here's Sam Altman, CEO of OpenAI.
I think the creative spirit of humanity is an incredibly important thing. And we want to build tools that lift that up, that make it so that new people can create better art, better content, write better novels that we all enjoy.
But according to many authors, artists, and journalists, it's all based on theft. That's because companies like OpenAI need a material to train their models, and a whole lot of that material is under copyright. Some groups are now about to challenge that in court. Recently, a coalition of Canadian news outlets got permission to proceed with a copyright lawsuit against OpenAI. So what are their chances? And how could lawsuits like this change the future of AI and of journalism? Then, rich oligarchs aren't just remaking the tech world, they're also increasingly reshaping democracy. I talked to author Jacob Silverman about his new book, Gilded Rage, Elon Musk and the Radicalization of Silicon Valley. This is The Rundown. Last year, a group of Canadian media companies launched a lawsuit against OpenAI. Here's a bit of the joint statement they released at the time. OpenAI regularly breaches copyright and online terms of use by scraping large swaths of content from Canadian media to help develop its products such as ChatGPT. OpenAI is capitalizing and profiting from the use of this content without getting permission or compensating content owners. Now, an Ontario court has decided the case can proceed here. I asked Kevin Siu, an intellectual property lawyer with Gilbert LLP, how this case is shaping up and how worried OpenAI should be about the multiple cases that have been filed against it. Kevin, welcome to The Rundown. How are you doing?
Good, thanks for having me.
Yeah, no worries. Now, before we get started, I want to mention that, and to our viewers, that TVO is not participating in this lawsuit that we are talking about, and you, Kevin, are not involved in the case, correct?
That's correct. I am a lawyer, but I don't represent any of the parties in the lawsuit.
All right, well, let's talk about the case. The plaintiffs in the copyright case against OpenAI in Ontario include the Canadian Press, Torstar, the Globe and Mail, Postmedia, and CBC. What are their main complaints?
So this is a conglomeration of, I think, most of Canada's biggest news publishers, and their complaints are pretty broad, but largely they focus on OpenAI's use of various news articles that they've scraped from online. So as you know, you can access CBC or the Toronto Star and get some news articles. Some of them are paywalled, and you can access those articles, and their complaint is that OpenAI has copied, downloaded, scraped some of these articles and used it to train their ChatGPT model in order to produce the product, ChatGPT.
All right. OpenAI uses what's known as retrieval augmented generation, and it's quite central to this case. For people who don't know, including myself, what does that actually mean?
Yeah, so retrieval augmented generation, or RAG is the acronym that's often used, RAG. That refers to one part of the sort of output process for these large language models. So if you've ever used ChatGPT and you enter some input and the ChatGPT bot says something, it goes through a couple of processes. One process is sort of taking your input, determining what it should do, and then there's a process at the end called RAG, which is used to prevent or limit hallucinations. What it does is when the output is about to be coming out from the LLM, the large language model, the RAG system usually is designed to access a fact storage or access the internet and fact check its own output before giving you an answer so that it can limit the amount of hallucination that the chatbot gives you.
So here in Canada, we have fair dealing, which for people who don't know is a law that allows us to use copyrighted material without permission for certain purposes, one of them including news reporting as well. Could OpenAI have its copyrighted material use that instead?
Yeah, so fair dealing is a very nuanced subject. It's often used as a defense, but it's also been called a user's right in Canada. So if you or I were just researching news for our own educational purposes, then we would be able to, buy a newspaper or access it online, and we can read it and perhaps reproduce a bit of it, send it back and forth for mark it up for research. And those are sort of allowable fair dealing purposes. They're sort of a scope of permitted activities that users in Canada are allowed to do with copyrighted works like books and news articles. And this is a central doctrine in Canadian copyright law, but it has certain limits to it. There are specified purposes like education and research where you're definitely allowed to use the fair deal work in a manner that is in accordance with fair dealing, subject to some limitations, but it often depends on what you're doing and how much you're using that work for.
Help us understand really what's at stake here with the plaintiff and OpenAI.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there are two aspects to it, at least two aspects. There are many more than that, but one is, as you've identified, it's monetary, it's commercial, which goes back to your last question about fair dealing. One of the factors as to whether some use is fair or not under Canadian law includes how commercial that is. So is someone like OpenAI or any other company making a lot of money off of, Toronto Star or CBC's news articles? And, they do charge a fee for using some of their, pro or plus versions of their products. So they are making some amount of money. And so at stake in part is who can profit off of those works. Obviously for news organizations, the core of their business is, selling newspapers, selling subscriptions to their website, and licensing their content to various outlets. And, as far as we know, and as complained in the lawsuit, OpenAI hasn't paid any licensing fees for the use of those works. So a large aspect of this is, should OpenAI pay for the use of those works, and how much should they pay for the use of those works? Because, some aspect of it is if you're, again, let's take an example. If it's just me and you going to buy a newspaper, we're paying a pretty low amount of money and we're not really profiting off of it. But a large company like OpenAI, which is, has millions of users, how much should they pay for the use of articles? And they use many millions of articles. So that's, a key aspect of the case.
What happens, let's say this court case goes through and the business model of OpenAI changes, where they do have to pay for something. How does that impact their bottom line and their business model?
Well, I'm not in charge of OpenAI, thank goodness. But I think it's pretty fundamental to how they operate. And I think if you sort of take apart and look at it at a more high-level view, for most of these companies who develop large language models, right, a part of the technological innovation that they claim to have brought to the forefront these days is that they've used or they've ingested into their AI models a large portion, if not all, of the internet. They claim, that's the large in large language model, and if they have to pay for a significant or all of the content that they're consuming, then it really could impact their bottom line, because they're certainly using a lot of data. They're continually scraping information, and depending on how much they have to pay to access or use that content, it could really impact whether or not those models become financially viable.
Kevin, we are going to leave it there. Really appreciate the insights, and of course something that we will continue to follow. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
US tech oligarchs are very, very rich, and many of them are also very angry at the woke mind virus, at regulation, at democracy. And they're using their extraordinary wealth and power to try to make the world reflect their vision. I sat down with Jacob Silverman, author of the new book Gilded Rage, Elon Musk and the Radicalization of Silicon Valley, and host of the CBC podcast The Making of Elon Musk, to find out how men like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel are combining corporate and government power in pursuit of their goals. Great to have you here, Jacob.
Thank you.
All right, I want to talk early history of Silicon Valley, because I think not a lot of people know that close ties to the Cold War, the national security state. When we talk about sort of the early funding for startups, those were coming from the Department of Defense, NASA. I want to get a better understanding. How did Silicon Valley later gain this sort of reputation as a bastion of progressive political ideas?
Sure. Yeah, in many ways, the Silicon Valley of today is actually returning to its early roots. But In the 70s and 80s, especially coming out of the 60s and 70s counterculture, the tech industry was seen as kind of a new frontier and a new area of almost countercultural experimentation. A lot of people, a lot of hippies who were involved in the hippie movement in San Francisco ended up learning how to program or getting involved in tech. And it was certainly seen as an industry that was much more liberal and progressive in its attitudes, open to kind of new forms of social experimentation. And it wasn't seen, and I think inside as well, the industry, it wasn't seen as close to the government or supporting the prerogatives of, say, the national security state or U.S. foreign policy. And we had that general attitude or culture for a little while, certainly in the 80s and 90s. I would say that was kind of the prevailing attitude in tech. But things really started to change after 9/11 and then have kind of intensified in recent years, I would say, until we're almost more back to the relationship that tech had in the 50s and 60s when it was being directly funded by the Defense Department.
All right, so let's fast forward here to 2024, the presidential election. According to the Washington Post, 80% of San Francisco residents and about 70% of residents in the counties near Silicon Valley vote for Kamala Harris. So explain to me, what do you mean by radicalization and sort of who are the poster boys? And I say poster boys because, incidentally, they're all men.
They are all men. I mean, there are a few prominent women in tech who are Trump supporters, like Safra Catz, who was the co-CEO of Oracle, or Ginny Rometty from IBM. But we are talking about, and this book is a little bit of a group biography of 20 to 30 men, almost all white men, who are millionaires and billionaires. They are CEOs of tech companies. They are venture capitalists. And of course, at the top of this heap is Elon Musk. But there's also a lot of his friends and colleagues, people from the greater PayPal mafia, as it's been called. Peter Thiel has long been probably the most important Silicon Valley conservative. And I think what changed really in the last few years leading up to the 2024 election was that you had some traditional tech conservatives like Peter Thiel or someone like David Sachs or some lesser known names like Doug Leone, who's a major venture capitalist. But then you had a lot of their friends and colleagues, people of a similar social status and economic status who spent time with them, who really did start getting radicalized against the Democrats and the Republican Party. And some of that, I think, did really start in San Francisco, where they started to see San Francisco as a failed city. And they blamed it on liberals and on Democrats. And they feared that what was happening in San Francisco, some of its social issues, the homelessness, the open-air drug use, they essentially decided that it couldn't be fixed. And not only that, it was spreading to other cities. And that, I think, explains a lot of the transformation. And then you also had some of these CEOs, people like Mark Andreessen, who's a major venture capitalist, starting to think that the social justice movements of the time, like Black Lives Matter, or more recently some of the protests against Israeli military activity in Gaza, they just found those movements unacceptable. You hear from senior people in tech, but publicly especially, that they think that this is wokeness run amok, or this is something that's gone too far. So whatever vision of kind of liberal attitudes or even social justice that some of these CEOs and venture capitalists may have tolerated before, certainly during the COVID era, that started changing to a degree that they either didn't recognize or weren't willing to tolerate anymore.
I want to talk a little bit more about Peter Thiel. A little bit different when you compare him to someone like Elon Musk, who you put on your book's title. A little bit more enthusiastic, someone who's called himself, at one time, a half Democrat, half Republican. But when you look at Peter Thiel, has always solidly been conservative. Help me understand sort of his influence on the radicalization of Silicon Valley.
He is sort of the presiding godfather of this movement, I would say. I mean, he is a political animal from the beginning, and someone like Elon Musk, I would argue, wasn't before. But Thiel has been a hardcore conservative / libertarian since he was in college at Stanford. He founded a conservative publication called the Stanford Review. He's been hiring people from that magazine ever since for his companies. And he was also a writer for a while, and he co-wrote a book called The Diversity Myth, which was basically, today we would call it kind of like an anti-woke, sort of rabble-rousing sort of book. But at the time, the big bogeyman was multiculturalism and political correctness, which in the early 90s kind of meant the same thing as what we might talk about wokeness or progressive politics now. So that has always been something important to Thiel. Max Chafkin, who wrote a biography of Peter Thiel, has said that the PayPal Mafia network, which we know as sort of the group of people who got really rich at PayPal and funded all these companies afterwards started more as a political network, Chafkin has said, rather than a business one. Yes, it came out of PayPal, but these were people who were some of them were very interested in politics, including Thiel. And Thiel was the Silicon Valley figure during the 2016 election who was kind of helping broker those connections between Silicon Valley and MAGA and the Trump campaign.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that time, just shortly after Trump's first term. I want to get a better sense of what's happening there, because at the end of that, in the beginning of his second term, Silicon Valley and the executives have kind of moved further to the right. What was happening between that administration, Biden administration, that kind of pushed everything that way?
Well, Thiel himself would say that the Trump administration was a little too chaotic for him, and I think there was some dissatisfaction among people in tech, or certainly some of Trump's conservative supporters, that they didn't get done the things that they wanted to get done. At the same time, during the Biden administration, this is when COVID was raging. This is when some of these entrepreneurs are coming into more conflicts with the state than they were used to. I would still argue that these weren't necessarily major conflicts by most standards, but for example, like some of the shutdowns or quarantine methods during COVID, Elon Musk especially was very upset about having to shut down his main factory in Fremont, California, his main Tesla factory. And that was something he battled with local authorities about, and he eventually said, you know what, I'm going to open it anyway. If you need to arrest someone, let it be me, in his sort of typical overdramatic style. But there were other instances, like Mark Andreessen, major venture capitalist, major political player now. He said that the red line for him was when the Biden administration proposed a tax on unrealized capital gains. It was really only over a very high amount of money, millions and millions of dollars, but this meant that if you were, say, a venture capitalist who invests in a startup, it goes public, the stock booms, and say you have $100 million in paper gains, you would maybe have to pay some taxes on it. Now, it's worth noting this was not implemented under the Biden administration. It was just proposed.
Right.
But that was something that Andreessen on his own podcast said was a red line and he really didn't like. So for some of these different people, there were different things, but they saw themselves now as being a little more oppressed by the powers that be.
How much of this radicalization of U.S. politics can be traced back to 2010? Because something big happens in 2010, Supreme Court Citizens United decision.
Yes.
Help us understand how that kind of opens up this door for tech elites to sort of, some would say, meddle in some of the politics here.
So now we live in the era in the U.S. of unlimited spending for political campaigns.
How much money are we talking? Give us a sense of that.
Sure. I mean, the last election, Musk donated more than, or donated is a funny term, but put forward more than $200 million, probably closer to 300. The crypto industry, who I talk a lot about in my book, became the biggest donor by industry. They donated about $200 million, mostly to one political action committee, one of these super PACs called Fair Shake. And I think, especially in the last election, the tech industry, when they get into something, sometimes they go all the way, and they're used to raising huge amounts of money. So to put $200 or $400 million towards a political goal for them makes a kind of sense. And we had seen since 2010 a lot of money flooding into politics and these huge super PACs being created, but we had never really seen one industry, or really tech and crypto together, they're kind of one and the same, put forward so much money at the same time. And that, I think, was really novel. And at the same time, you also had individual tech leaders, most notably Elon Musk, basically implant themselves within the Trump campaign, and Musk himself starting to be on stage a lot and at Trump's side. And that kind of behavior was also something we hadn't really seen before.
All right, I want to come back to a point that we were talking about sort of local politics. A few years ago, wealthy tech moguls started weighing in on local politics in San Francisco. Specifically, I want to read a quote from Gil Duran, a San Francisco-based journalist alarmed by the political ambitions of those people that you mentioned in your book. These people have enough money to be dumb and dangerous for a very long time. They have to start finding ways to seize territory and power and create a different world that doesn't look anything like the United States we have today. I think what we're seeing here in San Francisco politics is like the emergence of that strategy. What are some of the examples of the strategy that Duran is describing?
Well, there are a couple of important things there. For one thing, one of the changes that we started seeing a few years ago was tech people in San Francisco putting a lot more money into local politics because they realized they can get something for their money. So we saw a recall of members of the San Francisco School Board, something that had never happened before. There was, and people like David Sachs, who's now Trump's AI and crypto czar, were at the head of this. He was donating a lot of money. And then they tried to recall Governor Gavin Newsom. That actually wasn't successful. But then they had a big victory when they recalled the district attorney, Chesa Boudin, who was considered this reformist, progressive DA, but really got tarred as someone who was a Soros DA, who was letting criminals off and responsible for an upsurge of crime in San Francisco. And that was actually at the time even a misreading of the situation, I would say. The crime didn't necessarily, violent crime wasn't in a bad way in San Francisco. What you had was a lot of social destitution, you had a lot of property crime and nonviolent crime, but it had become very visible to people there and intolerable to the San Francisco elites. So that's kind of where it started. And when Gil is talking about seizing actual land and territory, I mean, there's kind of two tracks that we see the tech elites on. They're involved in regular politics, trying to influence what's happening in San Francisco and nationally via Trump. But they are also part of these movements. One's called the network state movement that Gil reports very well on. They're also called charter cities, where they're actually trying to gain land where they can have sovereignty over
Let's
it.
talk about it. Honduras.
Yeah,
What's happening
Honduras is the big one, which is there's an island called Roatan there, and there's a settlement called Prospera, which is owned by an American company, a piece of land there that under a previous, more right-wing Honduran regime, they were able to essentially buy sovereignty over this land and turn it into a charter city. And the main goal of these things is really to escape taxes, to have a sort of bespoke nation that is somewhat of a dictatorship, run by a small group of tech elites. And one thing that they talk about a lot that they want to do in these kinds of charter cities are medical experiments that may not be legal in the US or other countries. This very much relates to the industry's interest in life extension research or radical forms of human experimentation that most of us probably aren't that comfortable with yet. And there are a lot of efforts going on right now, from in Honduras to even places in the United States to the open ocean to Greenland. There's a big charter city startup that would be very happy to see Trump and the United States take over Greenland, because that's another possible territory. But really what they're looking for are places with weak sovereignty, or places where the local government has given up and they can hand it over to a corporation essentially, or a few American venture capitalists, and say, here, start your own community. And it's often presented as, hey, this is just, what's wrong with a new community or building something new? But in practice, these things look more like mini dictatorships that are really there to serve a few millionaires and billionaires.
You mentioned Greenland, so right off the bat, I'm thinking of Vice President J.D. Vance. Maybe not a favorite there, but you talk about him a bit in this book. He was sponsored early in his political career by Peter Thiel. Did Thiel create J.D. Vance in his own image, or in the same way he created, say, Prospera?
Vance was someone who met Thiel at a different point in his life when he was at Yale Law School, and as Vance has described it, he felt a little lost. I mean, Vance is someone who, through his own narrative and his memoir, has described himself as searching for a sense of identity at different points of his life. I mean, he even changed his name a couple times. He went into the Marines. He was trying to escape kind of Time's hard luck upbringing. And when he met Thiel, Thiel came to give a speech at Yale. Thiel is someone who goes to a lot of colleges, even still, to give speeches. And according to his account, he heard someone there who he thought was very smart, but also telling him to kind of get away from the merit-driven rat race of elite law. And also what he liked about Thiel is that Thiel's religious. He's a Christian. And that appealed a lot to Vance. And after that, Vance got in touch with him. And from there, his whole life really changed and was shaped by Thiel. But it was a choice, I would say, of Vance's, of him seeing someone who he could use as a model and a mentor, and then really going for it.
All right. Many right-wing moguls have denounced DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion policies, but I'm hoping you can help me understand the irony here, because it seems, in their own way, these wealthy tech moguls are obsessed with identity. How so?
Yeah, certainly a lot of them consider themselves elites, and some of them consider themselves genetic elites. I mean, and so in that way,
What's
they're
the distinction between those two?
well, unfortunately, you see a recurrence in what could politely be called eugenics in a lot of Silicon Valley. I mean, not just what I was talking about with this research into life extension, but a lot of research into IVF and different reproductive procedures that go beyond just trying to make people fertile or ability to reproduce, but actually screening babies or embryos for different qualities. And I think there is a sense among tech elites that whether you're a founder, which is a pretty hallowed identity, or an engineer or a venture capitalist, you are part of this distinguished elite. At the same time, more traditional forms of identity, like I think they are very conscious of their status, that most of them are white males, and they have chosen to think that DEI and any other diversity measures, and also social justice movements, that some of which try to right old wrongs against marginalized people, are instead a form of victimization or discrimination against white people like them. And so in that way, that they seem to feel like they're on the back foot, and that their own identity is threatened, that it's not okay to be a conservative white male. I certainly don't think that's true, and I think the proof is in how successful that they've been, but they feel like they sort of have to apologize, or they went through the Biden era having to apologize for who they are. And now there's a sense that they can be proud of who they are again, and part of that is considering themselves sort of these elites, the elect, who can rule over the rest of us.
Got one last question for you here. Tech moguls, as we discussed, have succeeded in not only limiting regulations for cryptocurrency, artificial intelligence, they're becoming more deeply embedded in the national security state, and they lead the anti-DEI sort of woke charge. What will they want in the years ahead?
Well, they're certainly looking to the government as a cash source. They want contracts with the government. They know that a lot of money is going to be coming from there. It always has, but given how right-wing tech elites have kind of circled around Trump and are populating his administration, they're now looking for big contracts. And I think that there's still going to be consumer-facing companies, of course, and trying to sell their products to the public. But with something like this Stargate initiative, which is hundreds of billions of dollars being put into data centers for AI and computing, that's a huge possibility for the tech industry. But now they're very, very proudly going back to working for the state, working for the security state. It's not just companies like Peter Thiel's Palantir. It's Google, Microsoft, all the tech companies, and also ones that are purpose-built to work for the defense and intelligence establishment, like Anduril. So I think that's where they see their future now. Is none of them are really libertarians in practice, even if they sometimes claim to be in theory. And they are much more willing to unite with the powers that be and to seek mutual profit and power there in a way that I think wouldn't have been acceptable kind of to the tech rank and file 10 or 15 years ago.
All right. Thank you, Jacob. This was a fantastic read. Thank you for raising the flags and really well-researched stuff. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
We are building this show for you, and we want you to build it with us. What issues do you want to know more about? What do you like or not like about what we're doing so far? Let us know. Send your feedback and ideas to tvo.org/rundownfeedback. Until then, we'll see you tomorrow.